This is Patrick Dolans with another presentation on the wolves, pussycats, and termites. As you'll recall, these three perspectives represent positions on the question of whether or not we should be worried about the national debt and the budget deficits. In this presentation, our attention will be focused on the termites. The termites, as you'll recall, are not willing to admit the deficit represents an immediate concern, but they're also not prepared to treat it as a trivial concern. For the termites, future generations will curse us for what we've done. To better understand the termite perspective, we're going to examine 4 dimensions of this view. We'll start by examining the cyclical or non-cyclical nature of deficit spending. Then we'll define and explore the notion of the external debt. Third, we'll look at where the money has gone. Finally, we'll spend some time on the notion of demographics. Let's begin with the first piece. Termites would be willing to embrace the idea that deficit spending in tough economic times makes sense, but only if you pay down the debt when times are good. If we think of the business cycle, and we think of the bathtub of the circular flow model, when the economy is struggling, when the water level is low in the tub, then a deficit is an appropriate tool. But when things pick up, when the economy begins to grow, that's the time to close the faucet somewhat of government spending and open the drain of taxes. From an economic standpoint, that makes perfect sense. From a political standpoint, that's an altogether different task. Take a look at this time series over the last 40 years. As you can see, what we have is a situation where 90% of the time the government ran a budget deficit. Only 4 of the last 40 years were surpluses. You can see the business cycle as you notice the ups and downs of the deficit. But more importantly for our purposes, the deficits seem to be the norm. Surpluses are the rare exception. That's not using deficit spending as a policy tool. That's using deficit spending as a substitute for something else. And for the termites, that's not sustainable long term. The second dimension of the termite perspective that we will consider has to do with the notion of external debt. When we look at the national debt, we can break it down into 2 components. Internal debt refers to that portion of the obligation that's held by U.S. individuals or U.S. institutions. The external debt refers to the portion of U.S. government debt that's held outside of the U.S. So, let's look at some numbers. Here's some data, a little bit older, from 1992 to 2007. As you can see from this graph, the externally held marketable debt went from about 20% in 1992 to over 50% just 15 years later. 2 things. First of all, that's a dramatic increase, more than doubling in just a 15-year span. But the second piece is really important for you to pay attention to. Notice that the key term here is percentage of total marketable debt. Let's take a short detour so that I can explain this to you. Recall that the national debt is on the order of $17 trillion. What the $17 trillion figure doesn't tell you is that a portion of that debt, roughly a third, is held by U.S. government entities such as the Social Security Trust Fund. And that portion of the debt is not marketable. Therefore, whenever you see a reference to marketable debt, we're looking at that portion of the debt that's not held by Social Security. So what this graph reveals is that 50% of the 2/3 of the debt that's not held by Social Security is outside the U.S. Let me say that one more time. 50% of the 2/3 of the overall debt is held outside the U.S. You can do that math in your head or on a calculator, or I can just help you with that. It means that it's not 50% of the $17 trillion figure that we're talking about here, but rather it's about a third of the total overall debt. So how we define these things makes a huge difference in terms of how we perceive the numbers. One more graph on foreign holding of U.S. debt. In this graph, you can see that China, not surprisingly, holds more debt than anyone else. Number 2 is Japan. There are a bunch of other examples here for you to look at when you have more time. But again, notice that when you add up all the external debt, you only get to about a third of the overall total. Nonetheless, that represents a serious concern. And the reason that the termites worry about the externally held debt is because those obligations will at some point have to be paid and represent future belt tightening for U.S. citizens. The third termite concern asks the question, what did we buy? If we had run up $17 trillion in obligations, but could say that we have successfully transitioned away from a fossil fuel-based economy into the fuels of the 21st century, then that would be an impressive investment. But we can't say that. If we could say that we have a $17 trillion debt, but we have state-of-the-art infrastructure, that might be worth justifying the borrowing. But we can't say that either. Our bridges are crumbling, and our light rail is nowhere near that of other industrialized nations. Maybe we took the $17 trillion and we guaranteed a full, free education all the way to graduate school for anyone who's qualified and willing to do the work. Well, that's a cruel joke. Student borrowing in the U.S. is higher than anywhere in the world and higher than at any time in history, because the cost of your education is squarely on your shoulders. No, we can't say any of these things. What can we say? Have a look at this graph. Table, excuse me. In the table, what you'll notice is that the U.S. spends more on the military than any other nation in the world. But not a close contest. In fact, number 2, China, spends roughly about a fifth of what we spend. And number 3, Russia, spends only half of what China does. Well, maybe it's just the cumulative effect of all those others beneath us that causes us to spend so much. But that doesn't make sense, because the United Kingdom and France, numbers 4 and 5 on the global military spending list, are close allies of ours. Indeed, the UK and France collectively spend significantly more than Russia. No, military spending can't be justified on the basis of threats. Military spending has other dimensions to it, dimensions we're not going to get into in this presentation. But clearly, if this is the kind of thing that we've done with those big deficits and the large national debt, then we have less to claim in terms of wise investment. By the way, SIPRI, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, is one of the premier international organizations for tracking military spending. SIPRI uses a different criteria than, say, the CIA, but SIPRI's criteria almost certainly are more legitimate. The final dimension of the termite perspective that we're going to explore has to do with demographics. We know that Social Security is a pay-go system. Pay-as-you-go means that each year the Social Security Administration collects payroll taxes from people who are working and pays out benefits to those who qualify. The pool of funds is used to cover beneficiaries, and then it's stockpiled. For over 2 decades, the Social Security Administration has run a surplus, meaning more money comes in payroll taxes than goes out in benefits. That's impressive and cause for congratulations. The problem is, we can readily identify a shift that's coming. We know the baby boomers are going to be retiring in larger numbers, and we know that the pool of payroll tax paying workers is shrinking relative to the people who will be collecting benefits. People are living longer than ever before, which means that Social Security recipients can count on more checks from the government. Take a look at this diagram. Half a century ago, 5 people paid in for every person who received benefits. We know within a few more decades, that number will be half, less than half of what it was. Only 2 people paying payroll taxes for every 1 person collecting benefits. That's a grim trend, and if nothing else is done, Social Security is in trouble. But surprisingly, Social Security is not the real concern. Indeed, with a few fixes, perhaps extending the age of eligibility, perhaps means testing who has access to the benefits, perhaps removing the cap on the maximum payroll tax. Some combination of those kinds of reasonable fixes could put Social Security back on track. Many economists, however, will tell you that the real demographic concern on the horizon is Medicare. Unless we bring healthcare costs under control as the baby boomers retire, government obligation for healthcare is going to break the bank. For the termites, these are all reasons to be very concerned about.